Welcome, everyone, to the Cup of Coffee podcast with me, your host, Tom Dillon. This has been recorded live at our weekly online meeting and broadcast around the world. Today's topic is building regulations requirements for sound testing within an HMO with James Robbins. Before we start, I'd just like to say by way of a disclaimer that today's wonderful discussion, but that nothing said here constitutes financial advice. You need always take professional advice before investing your hard-earned cash. There may be the odd unplanned swear word along the way as well. The format for today is that James will speak to us for a while, and then we'll be taking questions from the floor. James Robbins is the director for Studio Acoustics UK Ltd. He has been working in the field of acoustics for, I thought he said 80 then, but he doesn't look that old, for 30 years, and has designed and built multiple recording studios for bands and post-production facilities for TV and film, and created educational facilities within universities and schools. That is often the best place for educational facilities. During this time, he's developed a rounded knowledge of the construction industry and is qualified in electrical and air conditioning in order to be able to create a one-stop design / build package. Over the last 17 years, he's mainly been working with clients testing to comply with building regulations approved document E, brackets ADE, brackets sound testing, close brackets. He now spends, I'm not reading this out, he now spends around two-thirds of his time helping clients to create designs that will be compliant and cost effective, as well as being nice places to spend time for the occupiers. James is the first guy as well. I've ended that's the end of the bio. That appeared on the visual that we send with a seatbelt on. Because he's all about safety. He's a safety first kind of a guy, and I thought it was a very nice touch. With the visuals, I'm always looking for something a bit new and interesting, and he provided it in spades. Also, I'm delighted to say that his sound quality is good today because had he turned up today as the audio guy and his sound quality had been poor, I'd have thought this is no good. Hello, James.
The ropey start straight away, isn't it? Yeah, thank you. It's funny because the electrical side of the business that I used to run was called Safety First. So
Mm,
you've nailed that already.
nailed it. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. Hi Tom. Yeah, my name's James Robbins. I'm the company director for Studio Acoustics, and thank you for having me today. I've not done this before, so I've got a little list of bullet points in front of me below the camera, so it might look as if I'm just reading this straight off memory, but I'm not. I'm scripting myself to try and keep it within a time frame. Um, so today, yeah, I'm going to be talking mainly about house of multiple occupancy, HMO, and at least I'm going to try to stick to that. And I'm going to try and clear up some misinformation that's been around for a long, long time, in my opinion. And I'd like to help with developers that may be getting themselves into HMO. And I'd like to also talk about which wasn't included in the bio, recent effects of the implication of the Building Safety Act, which came out in April this year, which has affected me with regard to sound testing, and it will definitely be affecting your listeners. So before I do, I'm just going to go into a bit more background so that they know how and why I'm talking today, I guess. I find this bit a bit difficult because it's almost like I'm selling cars or something, but I'm not. I just want your listeners to know where I come from and how I know so much about the building industry. Over many years of time testing now, which is 17 or 18, I'm still getting clients of mine saying, where were you 6 months ago? Where were you 12 months ago? Because I've had to give them, unfortunately, bad news that they failed the sound test. And after chatting, they've realised they could have saved many thousands of pounds at the very least if we could have had the chat at the beginning rather than at the end. So if you can please bear with me just for a couple of minutes while I just go over where my background is, in a bit more detail. Then hopefully you'll have a little bit more faith in what I'm talking about. So about 30 years ago, getting old now, about 30 years ago, I started working in the construction of recording studios. The first big project was in Soundwell in Birmingham. And I was originally brought on for looking over the air conditioning and the electrical design and the complications that come with bringing those services into recording studios. I was qualified in electronics as well, so I was wiring recording desks. And halfway through that project, the then management team were laid off, and I was asked to last minute, could I just take over the build side of the recording complex? And this was a huge complex. My first house was about 39,000. This was like £250,000, and I was on a price on electrical and aircon at the time, and I was nervous, but I took it on, and I had a crash course in building recording studios. The guy that was looking over the project at the time, his name was Alan Caves, and he was the sound engineer for the Boomtown Rats, which is Bob Geldof's old band. And he was on the ball, Alan. So added pressure to make sure we tried to get things right, and we did. So it ended up being the largest multimedia educational center in Europe, apparently. So that was exciting stuff back in, I don't know, 94, 95. 96 maybe. But anyway, I ended up being management then for this company for a few years, and we worked all around the UK. I then ended up being a joint director of the company, and we spread out abroad to Portugal and even to places like Libya, where we worked for the late Gaddafi's, Colonel Gaddafi's best friend at Alwan Studios. We did that because the London circuit was where all of our that's where we wanted to be. That's where the post-production side is in the recording studio business, and that's where you want to get in. But it's a close market, and we had to go abroad, do this job for Libya, in Libya, sorry, and come back to London in 2001 with a bigger portfolio. The job in Libya was the biggest job I've ever seen. So we were able to knock on the doors. It worked. We ended up landing a job for Oasis Television, which was the biggest post-production company outside the BBC. In fact, it was the BBC. It was just full of BBC staff. It was the highlight of my career in the recording industry, and it set us up now. It gave us it gave us the gold star, the badge that we've been looking for. So we built them their only film suite there. It was a great job. At the end of that, now I'd been working for quite a few years in the recording business, covering everything, as I say. So I'm working with the sand, the cement, all of the stuff that the developers today will be working with: timber, glass, doors, air conditioning, electrical, M&E, carpets, the whole lot. But after doing Oasis Television and working with somebody for a year, for that last year, I decided to set my own business up. So I set up Studio Acoustics, and unbelievably, my very first client was Sony. You're not going to get a better client than Sony in your portfolio, but that was my first client. I went up against my old business partner in another competition and won the job. So yeah, 30 years ago, bringing me up to around about 2006-ish, I had a foreman, Brian from Norfolk, and he'd asked me, had I ever heard about sound testing? And I hadn't. Brian said, well, I've got a barn conversion. He was a developer, like lots of your listeners will be. And what's the sound test? I hadn't got an idea. My then client was Darren in Birmingham, and he'd asked me if there was any jobs going. He was a sound engineer of a big band in Birmingham. He had a big following, and he liked my company and my business company, I mean, and perhaps my personal company. But either way, he'd asked for some work. So it was a mistake. It was just not a mistake. It was an accidental setup of a business where Darren and I then set up a company. Our first client happened to be Brian, which was 12 months later when he completed his bar conversion. We carried out the sound testing for him. Took us 12 months to set up the company, £20,000 worth of equipment just for myself and for the same for Darren. So off we went. So what is sound testing? Some of your listeners might not even know what a sound test is. Some might have come into this with the title HMO and either buying an old pub, doing it up, or they're looking to. So I'll just touch on what sound testing is. So it's part of the building regs. I've started it 17 years ago. It's part of the building regs, and it's approved document E. Building regulations are set up alphabetically. So part P is electrics, part L is, I think, energy and EPC ratings, things like that. But part E is acoustics. This part's really quite important because people just think it's a sound test. A lot of developers actually think, well, it's a waste of time. Come on, what's a sound test? It's actually set up because of a 40-year study that the World Health Organization did. They looked into noise pollution. It's okay when you tell your kids to turn the music down. They generally will listen, really, but they should do. But if you ask your neighbor, if you ask people that outside of your household to turn the music down, you'll probably get a different reaction. So it's important that the wall between or the floor between you and your neighbor is at a certain standard. And the World Health Organization came up with a 40-year study that said that some people were dying up to 10 years younger due to just stress. They were skin and bone, they were stressed out, and something needs to be done about it. So all the governments came up with relevant ways of dealing with it. And in the UK, we came up with sound testing. So that's what the party document was based on. So an example of a sound test would be a semi-detached house, say. So you've got a semi-detached house and there's as a developer, you want to convert one side of that house and make 2 flats from it. So by making 2 flats, you've created a floor element, which is dividing those 2 flats. I know, Tom, you said I could send a load of slides in, but I'm pretty sure people, I'm pretty sure I can give you the visual on this. So you've got 2 flats, one above the other one. The dividing element is the floor. And by law now, by regulations, and they are mandatory, you should be having a sound test done through that floor. So we'll be looking for airborne sound. That's me talking on this podcast now today. The people upstairs might want to hear me. But I don't want to hear them either. And I also don't want to hear them dragging furniture around, walking around upstairs. So we do another test called impact testing. So you've got airborne testing through the floor and impact testing back down through that same floor. Because it was a semi-detached house before, you've got a party wall. By the book, that party wall is subject to a sound test. However, after doing this for years now, building regulations and the building control officers have realized I can't break into next door. I can't force them to let me in. And generally speaking, when the developers are making a racket whilst they're converting the house into 2 flats, the neighbors sometimes aren't always your best friends. So we can't get in. So building control used to insist that we got in. It caused problems for a few years. We come up with things called desktop studies where we use predictive software and whatever history we've got. Obviously, I've done nearly 4,000 tests now. So now I can give you a portfolio which can say, I've done loads of these walls testing. Here's 20. The average is a noise reduction of this. So probably, Mr. Builder Control Officer, the wall would pass. But when you start off, you haven't got that. You've got predictive software. It's the best you can do. So Builder Control, after a while, decided, you know what, as it was a house before and we've converted into 2 flats, perhaps we can just let that wall go. But don't be fooled. Sometimes they will insist on it. And it really does depend if what your relationship is with Builder Control. Don't upset them. Otherwise, they can go to town with the sound testing. So HMO, I've got a reminder here, it's supposed to be talking about HMO. HMO. So HMO, the problem I've had over all the years is house and multiple occupancy just doesn't exist in the approved document E. The approved document E is what I'm working to. There's many pages in there with many mentions of houses, flats, rooms for residential purposes, but HMO is not in it. And I'd say for the first 10 years of testing from around about 2006 to 2007, all the way up to 2016-ish, I never was even asked to do sound tests hardly in HMOs. Builder Control weren't requesting it. And I think personally it was because it doesn't exist as a word in the document. But in the document, there are, I just want to read this out. In the party document, there's rooms for residential purposes, and it says, I'll just read this out. From Building Regulations 2010, it defines a room for residential purpose as a room or a suite of rooms that is used for living and sleeping, but it's not a dwelling, a house, or a flat. So I'll read that again. It says that we have a room to reside in, which we sleep or we live in, and it's not a dwelling, a house, or a flat. So what's that? So the definition also, it includes, hostels, hotels, boarding houses, rooms of residence, halls of residence, but it excludes rooms for hospitals and similar establishments. So when we look at HMO, it doesn't appear in the party building regs, but rooms for residential purposes do. And it clearly states that these are rooms which aren't a dwelling, a house, or a flat, which is HMO. It always has been, and they always should have been tested, fully tested. When we say testing, the building regs were set up so that a box in your mind, your room in your HMO or your house, which is the outer box of the house, if you suddenly adjoin it or you split it in half and create a semi-detached house, you've now got 2 adjoining properties. The sound test's only required for adjoining properties. We don't sound test for detached buildings with a single ownership because we haven't got a problem with the neighbours. So HMO, for years, we were never carrying out sound tests. Then I would say probably 10 years after testing, we were asked to carry out through sound testing through floors only. I don't know why, but we were. I know businesses that were set up for HMO only to make money out of converting old pubs, say, into HMO. They would never ask to do sound testing. So they set up on the premise they wouldn't need a sound test, and not long afterwards, Building Control started catching up. They were asking them for the floors of HMO to be tested, but it only seemed to be the floors. But over the last 5 years, they're really hotter on this now, and they will be looking for all of the walls and floors to be tested. I've had a recent client that Tom knows about that just due to lack of knowledge didn't realize that the HMO building that they'd converted would require so much sound testing, and it could have been catastrophic for them. Luckily, it wasn't, but it could have been. So we test a 10%. It's a 10% rule with testing. So whatever element that's dividing you and your neighbor, we just test 10% of the same element. So if you had a row of barns and you've got 10 barns in a row and they're all built with the same construction, they've got a twin concrete block wall, or they're all one solid concrete block laid on its side. If they're all the same, we just test one pair. We're testing one wall of all the 10 of the 9 walls that divide the 10 barns, but we'll just test the one wall, any pair, because they're all the same. That complies with the 10% rule. If you develop and you create new walls of a different design in all of those 10 barns, all of those walls will be subject to a sound test because they're all independent of each other. So we have to clarify and make sure that 10% of all the different construction types are tested. So in your development, try and design them all the same so that you're not having to have more sound testing done, more opportunities for a fail. It just makes sense. So if we move on now, there's consequences for getting it wrong, especially with HMO and sound testing. I'm going to come on to the Building Safety Act in a moment, and this is why I think it's really important that Tom's brought me on today. So let's just say, up until now, I know loads of developers that have got HMO that have always invested in purchasing buildings to convert into HMO, and they're still on the phone every now and again asking for advice, but never get me in for sound testing. Somehow they managed to get around this. I'm not sure how. But let's just say you're one of those developers today and you're thinking of buying an old pub, creating it into, it's got 20 rooms. So you're going to create it in, I don't know, 18 HMO and a couple of kitchens, a couple of living rooms. It's 4-inch solid brick walls everywhere. So it seems good. And you've budgeted for all of that, the plastering, the electrics, the painting, and everything else that comes with it, fire doors and locks and whatever. You bought it at auction and you're expecting to pay the usual amount for doing this type of building up. And now you go to building regs. So what would happen then if building regs suddenly turn around now and say, actually now a sound test does apply and you need to carry out sound testing within that building? Just to give you a heads up, those 4-inch solid brick walls, they're never going to pass the sound test. So the norm would be you'd need to leave an air gap. You'd need to then create a stud wall either side it or another brick wall. That stud wall would need insulating. Your electrics and your plumbing would need to come off the existing wall and pull through onto the new wall. You need to line it with a couple of layers of fireboard. It can be pretty catastrophic. Not too bad at the beginning, apart from the fact that you haven't allowed for it in your budget when you bought it at auction, but horrendous if it's at the end, which happens. I get clients even last week that this genuinely happens to, and it can be catastrophic, especially if you put, you can buy these all-in-one cubicles for HMOs where there's a shower or, there's a toilet. It's a plastic cubicle, fits in the corner of the room. That's great. But it's not so good if you've had it all plumbed in, sat in the corner, and now you've got to move it out to put a 4-inch wall in. It's it's going over the window that was there, etc., etc. It can be really, really a big problem. And it can mean that your profit's gone or even your business is gone. And believe me, I'm talking to people that this happens to way too often. So if you've been getting how do I say this? If you've been lucky enough in some respects that this hasn't happened to you, and you haven't having to do sound testing in a HMO environment, then why should you be concerned today? And this brings me on to the Building Safety Act that was brought out and enforced at the 6th of April this year. I'm not an expert in this at all. I only know a little bit about it. And I'd just like to mention a few things here which were sent to me from various building control authorities. So basically, I didn't know anything about the Building Safety Act. I suddenly realized in about June or July this year that I was receiving loads of phone calls and stacked out with emails from developers that were very, very big, well-to-do developers. I won't mention names, but just sending over a £20 million set of drawings and saying, would I mind just casting my eye over and could I give their opinion if they thought, if there's any problems regarding the sound testing? I cast my eye over, I've been working with these clients for years. Oh, everything looks all right, should be okay. I had no idea until I was speaking with a building control officer in late June this year that he made me aware of the Building Safety Act and said, Well, now you need to have a lead design for each of the building regulations that apply to your development. And what that means is that I, as a building control officer, am asking the developers, the architects, well, who's doing the sound testing on this, who's involved with the electrics, etc., etc. And they need names put forward. So of course, these people were using me with a very blasé email. Oh, would you mind looking over it? Yeah, it looks all right. James Robbins looked over this drawing. What? 26 million pounds. And it actually happened on a project, which I, of course, I had to go back to him saying, hold on a minute. So as of April this year, this Building Safety Act came out. So I've been led to believe, and this is my own experience from dealing with building control officers. Please, as I say again, this isn't in red. This is what I want your developers to please go and look into. It's imperative as the developer that you look into the Building Safety Act. So in short, I think that the Secretary of State, I'm guessing, the Secretary of State for Housing, had looked into why there was no one responsible for the Grenfell Tower fires. Obviously, dreadful for everybody, but they've been really struggling to get to the bottom of why on earth did it even happen, who's responsible, etc., etc. And I think at that point, the government were actually were made aware of how building regs works with developers and builders moving forward. And I think, were a bit shocked to see that the building regs just looks really in depth at things at the end of the project, not at the beginning. So you hand them the certificates after you've completed and then say, is this okay? And then they say yes or no. But that's at the end. And I think the Secretary of State, so I'm told, was horrified by this, or people in government up high were saying, well, why have we even let them start the build? Why are they even starting? Who the heck's doing it? What the heck's going on? This is 2023, because it came out in October 2003, was enforced in April the 6th, 2024. So they shook the whole system up. There's something which I've gone, my tablet's gone off now, but there's a governing body now. It's been set up to look at the building control bodies and look at the way that they've been performing. Two building control bodies, independent companies that I know, on the 6th of April this year, wound themselves up, disappeared, gone. Too much legislation. I don't know why. I don't know how good at their job they were, but they're gone. I'm not sure why, and I'm not going to touch on that today, but they have disappeared. And there's a regulative body that looks at the building control officers themselves, and they're now forced to do courses themselves, even to make sure that they are deemed acceptable to look at all of your developers and to establish whether they think the development should start. So this is important. So whilst before certificates were just required at the end, now your developments after the 6th of April this year, building control, if they're not already, will definitely soon be asking you as a developer to come forth with names for each of the various parts, sorry, of the building regs. Part P, electrics, part E, acoustics, part L, EPC ratings, energy, and stuff like that. So you might not have those names at the beginning, but if you don't have names, you might find that they don't give you the permission to even start the build. So things have really changed around. So back to HMO and my concerns with the HMO. Okay, so there's something that's been brought along with the Building Safety Act, which is titled New Responsibilities. And I've spoken to Tom a little bit before this podcast to even see whether what I've got to say, have I got anything interesting to say? Is it worth the time of day for your developers having a coffee on their valuable Saturday mornings? And since talking to Tom, I've discovered something through talking to Building Control, and I had this sent to me, and I was quite shook by this, really. And as a developer, I have done a little bit of development. I want your guys to be part of the team here with your podcast, and I think this is really important. So, as I said earlier, the World Health Organization have done a 40-year study into advising why they believe people are dying, perhaps even up to 10 years younger. And it was introduced, and they introduced the sound testing to building regs. So this new responsibilities states that this is sent to me by building regs. So please, if it's wrong, it's not my fault. The building regulation officer sent me this recently. It says building owners, landlords, and developers are required to pay for remediation of historical safety defects. What does that mean? It says that they may need to pay the building safety levy on new residential projects. So after the 6th of April, they brought in a new levy, making landlords building owners and developers responsible. Think of the Grenville Tower. I've got a friend who lives in London in another high-rise tower. He was paying X and Y rates for the building that they lived in, and all of a sudden his rates went up by 20, 25%. And they were flabbergasted. They're already living on a shoestring, and they were told, we're going to reclad the building and you people are paying for it. What? What? Sorry? Yeah, the people that live in the high-rise building are being forced to pay for that cladding. However, this was all established before the Building Safety Act came in. And as of the 6th of April, it states new responsibilities as building owners, landlords, and developers. And they are required to pay for remediation of historical safety defects. I don't know whether that means before the 6th of April, but I'm obviously sure that it means that if you're doing anything now, moving on from the 6th of April, that if there's a problem with the building, it will be the responsibility of the building owner, the landlord, and the developer, not the people that are living in it. That's a massive change. You are now responsible for the well-being of your building. So what's this got to do with me as a sound testing guy and HMO? Well, it could potentially have a lot to do with it, especially if you've not been sound testing your HMO for a long time, because the World Health Organization state that people are dying early. So let me go to my script. So as the building regulations brought out sound testing in 2003, that's a long time ago. That's 21 years ago. What happens if somebody says that they're now, they're suffering? They are, not feeling too good. They've been stressed out with the neighbors next door. And they feel that they haven't had the building built to the building regs. So they question the sound testing that was maybe done. When they find out that there was no sound testing done, as I know 90% over many of the years was never carried out in HMOs, but it is deemed a residential place of residence and should have been. So moving forward as of the 6th of April, what happens if somebody's moved in, they fall out with another HMO person next door, they can hear them. I've literally been into places where there's a 3x2 stud. It's very common in HMO, unfortunately, and there's a couple of layers of fireboard to comply with the fire regulations, but I've been in there, you can hear a guy stirring a cup of tea next door. It's not a place you want to live in. Some developers deem that acceptable, others don't, and they'll have a big air cavity gap and another 3x2 stud double boarded and insulation on. You won't hear that cup of tea stirred, and it'll pass the sound test, and everybody's happy. If you're passing your sound test, guys, there's not a problem here. There won't be a problem with this new responsibilities. My issue is for people that haven't been. I don't really know how to say this correctly. I'm not used to podcasts. I don't want to get anyone into trouble, but there is a difference, as there is in any standard, isn't there? There's a difference from developers from high end to low end. If you're a developer that deems it acceptable to not bother with sound testing, to think it's not worthwhile, and people fall out with each other and they get another sound testing company in and they have a sound test done, and you've got a 3x2 stud wall with a couple of layers of fireboard either side, it will catastrophically fail that sound test. If that person's been on ill health for a long time now, and if they're saying nothing's been done, I've been banging my head against the brick wall, they may be able to go along the path of the Building Safety Act and go along the lines of who was responsible under the New Responsibilities Act, acting part of it, that says that the building owner is responsible, the landlord's responsible, the developers were responsible for the fact that person's ill. And at the very least responsible to come and make sure that the building complies. Well, you've got a finished product now. Your building's up and running. The bathrooms are in everywhere. The kitchens are all in. It's all fitted out. And now, just because a person has had a sound test done with unbeknown to you and taken it up with, you know what it's like now, win no fee. Teams of gangs that are around now are like hound dogs. They're looking for things all of the time to make money for them. And I know at some point that I believe they're going to be jumping all over this. So I think that it's time for you to catch up to speed with the responsibilities as a landlord, as a developer, as a building owner, with this new Building Safety Act that came in April. And I genuinely do worry that if you're of the thinking that the sound test isn't important, well, it is. And you'll have an argument against the World Health Organization who've got 40 years of study based on this, and you'll get nowhere with it. I have actually been involved with 2 court cases over the last 17 years where I've come in, been asked to do a sound test. There's nothing worse than giving a client the bad news they failed a sound test. And by the way, here's the invoice. Can you pay me, please? For some funny reason, they don't want to jump at at paying that invoice. And you've now had to tell them what this bad news means for them and the costs involved with getting it through a sound test. Well, on 2 occasions, what I thought was bad news was turned around when one little old lady that I didn't think could walk was literally jumping up and down. I was so excited and I thought, her hearing's gone. I'm really sorry, you failed the sound test, I repeated. And I was told, yes, I know. And I'm over the moon because I've been at heads and loggerheads with the builder for 5 or 6 years. I've got nowhere. You've now given me the proof that this building it does not perform to the latest party standards, and I want to take them to court. Next thing you know, I'm in court. Right. One thing I haven't added here, and it is important. Well, if it did go to court, who's responsible for the sound test? I'm a builder. I'm a developer. I followed all the drawings from the architects, so it's not my fault. Well, unfortunately, the building regulation starts in early paragraphs that it says from memory that it is the responsibilities of the developer, the architects, the builder, building control, and for the test body to make sure that everything complies with the party building regs. So when it went to court on both occasions, the costs that were incurred was divided by the architects and the builders and the house owner. Everybody had to put their chips worth in to pay and correct for that building to be put right and pass the sound test. So I'm at 29 minutes and 33 seconds, and I believe I was given 30 minutes, and I'm finished. So hopefully there's been some information that it's of use to your listeners. I can talk about anything to do with sound testing, not just with HMO, and hopefully I can be of some assistance.
On time and on budget. No, thank you very much indeed. On time and on budget as usual. And enjoying a well-earned coffee there.
Wow, I went quick. For me.
Thank you very much, James. I really appreciate that. I've cards on the table, very quietly, of course. The jokes are endless, aren't they? I've always been a big fan of acoustics. I think I'm deaf in one side, and so I've always been interested in sound and where it's coming from, and why can't I hear it? It's usually my problem. But always had interest. And then when we got into property, I was fascinated. I remember the first time I saw a wall, and there's probably a fancy name for this. I'm not good at fancy names, as people probably worked out by now. But there was a wall with the timbers offset, so that you could then wrap the insulation between the wall in a way that so that the sound none of the vertical timbers were attached to both sides of the walls. So the sound, as I'm sure you know,
staggered stud system, they call that staggered stud.
Staggered stud. There you go.
Yeah,
so I saw that, and that business partner Chris has been doing that. So I just saw it, and I remember thinking that is simple and smart and clearly going to make a fairly big impact. And there's lots of other things. That's just one tiny example. It's one thing that got me interested in it. And we've all been in those apartments, flats, HMOs, rooms, whatever, where you think this is bobbins, isn't it? You really can, it's like it reminds me of what's that 70s show with the rising damp? It reminds me of these horrible like 70s bed sits where, and you still get them now, not rising damp style 70s bed sits, but you get stuff where you go, as you say, I can hear a man. Made me chuckle when you said that. I can hear a man stirring his cup of tea next door. This isn't great. So I find the whole thing really fascinating, and it's even more fascinating if it's potentially going to either cost people loads of money or, looking at it in a more positive light, be a great opportunity for, as you say, the people watching and listening to this to do a good thing, both for the occupiers and probably for their wallets to avoid ending up in a bad situation. So, and I think most importantly for me is end up with good development. Like we've been lucky to have good sound tests, good systems on our developments. We've made mistakes, but I think the sound we've done quite well on. And when you go in, it's not fancy, some of the ones we've got, but they're good and they're solid, and you cannot hear the neighbours. And it makes such a big difference that you get your own sort of about privacy, isn't it? Private space. Yeah. And it makes such a big difference to. I think it's massively underrated how important it is. Right. Ramble over. Let's get to some questions. If anyone could pop some in the chat, if you have them, or shout them out, whatever, raise a hand, and we'll get to as many as we can. I've got a couple. We got one that came in prior to the talk, even because someone got excited and wanted to ask a question. So, before I wanted to do that, I wanted to just summarize, and you had made many points there, but if I was to summarize your main point, it's building regs hasn't been the best historically at checking everything maybe it should be checking. No criticism of building regs if you're listening.
No.
I love building regs. Everyone loves building regs. But that seems to be tightening up. And with this new legislation that you talked about that came in this year, 2024, um, that's likely to tighten up further, and the responsibility seems to be shifting or has shifted more towards the owners and the developers, and therefore it's something that for whether you're developing a HMO or flats or whatever it might be, it's something you should be increasingly aware of, both to make sure you are able to provide brilliant accommodation for people, but also to avoid the downside of potential either court appearances and court costs and things like that, horrible things, or you develop, get into the end of your development and realize it's going to fail a sound test that you didn't realize you needed.
Yeah,
Is that a
yeah,
decent summary?
yeah. Actually, if we can just pause there, because this is actually a really important point. I think that it's that what I well, I think it's brilliant that they brought
Mm,
this responsibilities thing in, and that they
yeah.
want named persons at the beginning of the development. And
Mm,
just hear me out. There's a really good reason for this. Even last week, I think 3 days ago, even this week, sorry. Well, it's last week, isn't it? I was called by a developer who said, I've been asked to do a sound test. I didn't know anything about it. And it is so common that building regulations have gone through their tick list at the end of the job. We've got the electrics, we've got the gas. Oh, acoustics. Hello, Mr. Developer. By the way, have you had a sound test done? What? You've been to site 2 years running. I'm not having to go at building control, but it's just the system that they work to means that there's a checklist has been for years at the end of the project. Now they're bringing it to the beginning. It means that it's far less likely that these poor developers that do nothing about a sound test, that if they'd been given the chance, they could have done something. They don't want to now realize that they've painted and plastered the wall and put kitchen units all over that wall. And now I've told them that kitchen to bedroom in the flat next door has failed. And the bedroom next door has got a little ensuite on it with some tiled area. One of the sides of the wall has got to be completely ripped off, taken apart. Or if it's a kitchen to kitchen on that floor, it's the only room we've been told to test from building control. One of the kitchen units has got to come off. All of the kitchen units on one side has got to come off. It's not fair to find that at the end, and it's not fair if you didn't know anything about it. But it happens every day of the week in my working life over the last 17 years. It's still happening today. So the great thing about this building control going to your developers and saying who's responsible for it, it might just save that developer when they speak to somebody like myself and I say, by the way, watch out, you've got to comply with this, that, and the other will need to be done. It'll ensure that they find it at the beginning when it's really cost effective, because at the end, in my experience, it's way more than 10 times. It'll cost you more than 10 times to correct that wall at the end than it will at the beginning. So yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point.
super. Yeah, really, really, completely agree. Um, Chris asks, does having laminate floor in an upstairs room make a big difference to sound transmission to downstairs over something like carpet?
So the only way, well, yes, it makes a little bit of airborne difference, but it helps with impact testing. However, so it's a trick question, really. If you go by the book, we're supposed to carry out impact testing on what is the subfloor, the building floor, before any furnishings go on. And it actually states in my document that any carpets and laminate floor should be removed before we carry out impact testing. And when we first started, it was a big problem. We were peeling carpets back. We were removing a meter squared of laminate floor and getting the builder to hacksaw it out so we could put our test pad in it, which is a set of hammers, the hammers away on the floor. Over the years, that doesn't happen anymore. We will just log in our report that there's a carpet that's been glued that we can't lift up, or there's a laminate floor, and we'll place a board over the top. But it's kind of cheating in a way, because it's going to improve the impact test, because your laminate floor is sat on a resilient layer when your carpet's sat on underlay, and we put the board on it. So it's going to make a massive difference to the impact. But then we'll reflect that in the report and say, well, you've wrongly improved your impact testing by 8 decibels. If we take that off, you should have passed anyway, or it would have maybe failed. And we leave that with building control. So laminate floors aren't supposed to be down before we do the sound test, is really the short answer to the question. If you want to do it right and have definitely no comebacks, we're supposed to be in before any furnishings go in.
Excellent. Isu asks, James, does this apply to commercial buildings, e.g. office space?
Absolutely not. So it's a great question. Why didn't I think about putting that in? So another thing I should have stated, the whole reason for the party building regs and the whole reason the World Health Organization did their 40-year study was for us, the public, in our living space. We're not interested at all in commercial. So if you have a flat, it's really common nowadays for me to go into places where everything's being snapped up by developers. We're running out of places to develop, aren't we? If you've got a shop, and above the shop, you've got premises, which were storerooms. This is very common today and still in abundance. And you want to create a flat above that shop. Um, it's different than the scenario I gave earlier on when I said a semi-detached, two flats, one above the other one, where you do impact testing through because you have domestic people living below domestic people. If you've got commercial people working below or in environment below domestic, we're only interested in the airborne side that the commercial people will pollute into the domestic side. So I would carry out an airborne test from the shop downstairs up through the floor into the flat above, but I won't be doing impact testing back down. I've been involved with clients that have been conned out of a lot of money by ripping up carpets and putting a rubber layer down on all their floors because they failed a sound test by a company that sells rubber underlay. And they've gone to them for acoustic advice and said, we failed the sound test. What can we do? Haha, buy a rubber floor, put it all down. It'll be great. Yeah, in the small print, it'll pass the impact testing, which it probably had already passed anyway, but it won't make any difference to you. You're airborne. And a lot of people are getting, it's really key to get to speak to somebody that knows what they're on about right at the beginning of your project.
Excellent. Mark with a C asks, it's okay though because he's not British, so we'll forgive him the spelling. He says, wondering if there is. By the way, these are great questions today. What have you done with my regular audience? Wondering if there is the equivalent of the energy efficiency certificate and rating for sound.
Equivalent of the EPC, is that energy performance
Yeah, I did. I
certificate?
say that wrongly. Yeah, I think it's
Yeah,
like
no.
a
So,
yeah.
well, I work hand in fist with one particular chap, Ben. He's great from UK Completions. I'll put a shout out to Ben because he's really good at his job. Um, and I know other guys. If you don't like Ben, I'm sure you will. But basically, I work alongside these guys because at the same time, if you're requiring a sound test in a new build, so in new building, the EPC ratings and SAPS calculations are done, and you're asked to bring in a guy that will come in with a fan. He'll strap up your front door. He'll extract air from your building or pump air into it to a pressure, and it's a pressure performance test. It's an air leakage test. So they'll be testing to see how airtight your building is. Because if you fill it up with hot air, we don't want it to leak because that's ruining the planet, apparently. Even though we drill great big 4-inch holes in the wall for our fresh air because we've got a boiler in there and we've got other air, regulations that state that we need ventilation in, we still have to air test it. So um, the air testing guys have they're completely separate from the sound testing. Um, Air testing requires the EPC guy to come in first, and the energy and performance guys will actually give a figure, a rating, 5 or a 6 or something like that. They'll give a rating to the guys that come in for the energy performance. So the guys that do the air testing, they need the EPC guys to give them what rating they've got to achieve. And they then come in and try and let you know whether your house performed to the energy performance rating. So they're part of a chain. The acoustic side of it, we're not part of anything. We're individual. We are just on our own. We come in. We don't need any information from anybody else. We're not related to any SAPs or calculations from the energy performance guys. We just come in and we have ratings. So what are those ratings? I've not told you what those ratings are. There's a big so we pass a sound test and we think it's great. Well, you alluded earlier on in your own developments that you're happy with what you're doing, Tom, and you know that you can't hear anything from next door. I can guarantee you now that if you can't hear anything at all from next door, you're already performing above the minimum rating that's required for sound testing. Minimum ratings for sound testing. Why does it come about? Basically, if I'm having this podcast now, as I am, and the people next door, they have the right to not hear my voice. They might hear a real distant rumble if I start laughing and things like that, but they won't hear the audibility of my voice. They won't know what I'm talking about. That's what the sound test wants to remove, the audibility of that. If I bring a baby into the room, which would be amazing, but if I somehow brought a baby into the room or put a Hoover on, or up the levels of what's a normal general conversation, that will be expected to be heard through a wall that's past the sound test. So sound testing, I'll just touch on that a little bit because it is important. Maybe listeners haven't asked this question, but anyway, it's important. So a sound test is just basically there to cut out general conversation. That's it. If you're a developer and you want to set yourself out from others, I do seminars, or I've done a few in the past, and I try and let developers know air gaps are free and they increase the noise reduction. So a typical sound test through a typical wall will mean that it's based on really kind of like a 1950s, 60s building, solid 9-inch brick. Really sort of based on that. A normal 9-inch brick wall will perform around about 47 decibels, 48 decibels of noise reduction. I can really go off on one here and I won't, but when we talk about decibels and noise reduction, please don't get confused. This is an important part, actually, so I will talk about this. There's a lot of developers say to me, I've bought a door, it says it's 40 decibels or 43 decibels noise rated, but they don't realize it's got a little thing after it called RW. Now, RW ratings are what we use to rate products like glass, doors, plasterboards, things like that. But they're tested in an anechoic chamber, which is a solid concrete bunker. It's got solid concrete floors, solid concrete walls, and a ceiling, and the materials put across and a test done through it. There's no flanking around the edges. There's no flanking over the top or underneath. It is just a sound test straight through that material. And it's given an RW rating. And really it's there so you can rate that door against another door. One door's at 30 decibels rating, one's at 40. So there's 10 decibel difference. And that's a solid rating in RW. If you bring that material though and put it into a building site, I will guarantee you that you can lower that rating by 8 to 15 decibels. So that person saying to me, I've got a door, it's rated at 43 decibels. So why are you complaining that I've got a 3x2 stud wall in when a door on its own will meet 43? Then I have to explain, well, yes, you're meeting 43 decibels RW. If you go on Google now and search for products, acoustic products, they'll set an RW rating after it. It's no good in real world because the real world doesn't have 4-foot concrete floors and walls and ceilings. In the real world, you've got to reduce it by 8 to 15. So that door now comes in and it's, 30 decibels. And it's a long, long way away from 43. The difference in sound of 10 decibels is the equivalent of double or half. If you as a developer are being asked by the building regs to meet 43 decibels is the typical material change of use rating that we have to pass for airborne sound tests, 43 decibels of reduction of sound. If I was to be recording our conversation now, Tom, it'd probably be around about 65 decibels on my meter. If I reduce that by 43, or for a new house, 45 decibels, just 2 decibels more. Let's say that if I'm talking at 65 and I reduce it by 45, we're left with 20 decibels of sound. That's very, very low amount of sound. And that's why we have 45 decibels reduction through the wall, because a conversation starts at 65, the 20 decibels that's left, it's inaudible. So it satisfies
Could you
building
give us an
regs.
example using your years of experience of what a 20 decibel conversation might sound like?
Yeah, very, very. My PC that's sitting next to me now with the fans we're in is rated at about 28. So it's even louder than 20 decibels. And that's just the fans in my PC. 20 decibels. So when I'm doing a sound test, part of a sound test, so this is probably worth knowing as well. When we do a sound test, I measure my speakers in the room that I'm with, and I have my ear defenders on, and I might be at 100 decibels. I go through to next door, flat above, or the building next door, and I look at my meter, and let's say I've got 50. So I start on one side with 100. I've gone next door, I've got 50. So you think that that wall is reduced the 100 down to 50. So I've got 50 decibels, nearly. But we also take in consideration the reverberation of the room that we're receiving the sound in, because that affects the result. And also the background readings. So I might be doing a sound test in a new development in a field with the nearest anything near to me is miles away. I might be doing the same sound test in a high street in Birmingham, where right outside those front sash windows, which is only 1 pane thick because that's all that was there in a listed building. Outside of that, double-decker buses going up and down. The background noise is really high. So we have to cater for that in the test and take that out of the test to give us a result through the wall, you see. Background readings in a very quiet space in a field somewhere, the lowest kind of readings we'll ever see is 20 decibels. So it's really, really low. So if we start with 65 in a conversation, we're reducing that down to 20 through the wall, we're left with hardly anything. And that's why we have those figures.
Super. Julie says, "Wow, James, awesome, really helpful. Bit over enthusiastic, but okay, we'll go with it." And she's
Thank you,
a
Julie.
positive lady, so we'll let her off. And then she goes on to say, "Yes, agree. Great legislation and governance around this. How do you work with developers? Can you talk through how you'd work with a developer of, for example, a 6-bed HMO at the design stage?" And the answer to that is absolutely not. Well, you could, I'm sure. I feel confident you could do it, but we haven't got the time. So that gives us a great excuse to A, stop, and B, get you on again. So it gives us a little hook for next time. But that's the kind of thing that James could do. If
Yes.
people think, you know what, I've learned from this is I need a sound guy because I've got a development and I didn't know anything about this, which is probably the sweet spot for this. People will as always post James's contact details with the podcast. But for those people who are lazy, what's the best way to get hold of it that you don't mind being public? Have you got a phone number
Yeah,
or an email or
yeah,
what's
phone
best?
number. Yeah, mobile's the best. You've got my mobile details there, Tom. I guess you'll add this. I don't
I
have to
have, but
repeat it now, do
people
I?
are lazy. Shout it out if you know it, or do
Yeah,
you not
so
know
you
your
can
own number?
contact me on my mobile, which is 07803 240 455. That's glued to me all the time. You can email me at info@studio-acoustics with one c.co.uk, and I'll reply to that. Yes, I can help you all the way along. I mean, I'll give free advice over the phone to anybody. It doesn't cost anything. Even if you're doing a development and there's been an appointed sound testing guy at the end, I don't care. I really want to help. Give me a ring and I'll help you with any advice that I can give you. Most test bodies that are out there, and I will shout this out to myself because I've been told this time and time again. Most test bodies are guys that have come in 49 minutes, guys that have come in, they've been educated and they know how to carry out the actual sound test, but they have no idea what your building's made of and what it is. Obviously, that's why I wanted to say my background in the beginning. I'll give you free advice. We can do desktop studies. You can send me videos, plans, and stuff like that in, or I can do a site visit. Each of those has a ladder of some cost attached to it, and I can help you out after this podcast.
All of those calls are guaranteed at no more than 63 decibels, which is always nice to know as well. Um, Thank you very much for everyone who's attending and listening and watching. Thank you especially to our speaker today, Mr. James Robbins, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Tom. See you, everybody.